Video 27 of the Lessons in Logic playlist. And in this video, we are going to talk about what is a Sorites and what do we do with them. And it's actually pretty simple. A Sorites is a chain of syllogism. Usually the final conclusion is stated, but the sub-conclusions are left unstated. Now, if you find an exception, someone states the sub-conclusion and leaves the final conclusion implicit, I won't say it's not a Sorites. Usually, though, the final conclusion will be stated, but not the sub-conclusions. So, for example, all cows are bovines, all bovines are mammals, and all mammals are animals, and no animals are politicians, so no cows are politicians. That is a chain of syllogisms in Act 3. So that's what a Sorites is, and what do we do with them? Well, we break them up into their constituent syllogisms and check each syllogism for validity by itself. In this argument, our syllogisms are, for the first two premises plus the first unstated subconclusion, all cows are bovines, all bovines are mammals, so all cows are mammals. For the next one premise plus its unstated conclusion, all cows are mammals, borrowing the subconclusion from the first syllogism, all cows are mammals, all mammals are animals, so all cows are animals. Now, I think you'll find this in probably every Sorites you look at. I don't want to promise that without thinking through very carefully what is the structure of a Sorites. And I'm pretty sure you would find that in every Sorites, that once you identify the first syllogism, you'll be left with a subconclusion that is one of the two premises for your next syllogism. So you'll only be able to add one premise at a time as you keep making your syllogisms in the chain. Keep re-articulating each syllogism in the chain, because the syllogism can only have two premises, and for every syllogism except the first in the chain, probably every syllogism will borrow, every syllogism that's not the first syllogism in the chain will borrow for one of its premises the subconclusion of the last syllogism. Anyway, let's get back on track with breaking this one down into its constituent syllogisms. All cows are bovines, all bovines are mammals, all mammals are animals, and no animals are politicians, so no cows are politicians. Gives us first, all cows are bovines, all bovines are mammals, so all cows are mammals. All cows are mammals is the implicit subconclusion. We have to bring it out into the syllogism, make it explicit to test the argument for validity. Next, all cows are mammals, all mammals are animals, and no animals are politicians. Importing the subconclusion from the first syllogism, and then adding one more premise. Now I'm adding one more premise. No animals are politicians, and borrowing our subconclusion from the second syllogism, all cows are animals, therefore no cows are politicians, and that's the final syllogism, giving us the final conclusion, no cows are politicians, and we would check each of these for validity, I'm afraid, one at a time in order to test the argument for validity. So that's it. A Sorites is a chain of syllogisms, where usually the subconclusions are unstated, but the final conclusion is stated, and what we do with them is we break them up into their each different link in the chain. Break the chain of syllogisms up into two or more syllogisms, and then test each syllogism for validity using whatever tool you need to for what we already have. You can use the mood figure method, you can use the Venn diagramming method, you can use the 6 rules method, you can use any 2 of those, you can use all 3 of those, you can use whatever method your teacher tells you to use. So now let's practice with an example I like. I checked the internet for the exact wording, and this is what the internet tells you. This is the quote from Legally Blonde. I suppose these days that's an old movie. In my day, it was a new movie. Anyway, Legally Blonde has, what's her name, Reese Witherspoon, is that her name? It has the protagonist saying, exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Happy people just don't shoot their husbands. Note that the final conclusion is not stated. This is in a legal context where the protagonist is telling her fellow law people that the defendant is innocent. This woman is accused of murdering her husband, and the protagonist thinks she did not. Why? Because happy people don't do that, and you know she's happy because she exercises, right? So this is the argument, and the implicit final conclusion is the defendant is innocent. So the first thing to do is to break down this argument into its constituent arguments. Break down the syllogisms, break down the chain of syllogisms into one syllogism, another syllogism, well, maybe 3, maybe 4. Let's see how many we have. Break it down into its constituent arguments and then test each of them for validity, each of them. So let's see. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Therefore, conclusion. People who exercise are happy. That's the implicit subconclusion. A subconclusion. Do I need to redefine that term? I mean, it's been defined before, but maybe some of you have forgotten. Maybe people are not watching this series in order. A subconclusion is a statement and an argument which is a premise with respect to the final conclusion, but is itself the conclusion to other premises. So the statement, people who exercise are happy, is plainly the conclusion with respect to the premises. Exercise gives you endorphins, and endorphins make you happy. But it is a premise with respect to the final conclusion. Let's see how it gets there. How do we get from that premise, that subconclusion, to the final conclusion? Well, people who exercise are happy. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. That is the second chain in the syllogism, borrowing the subconclusion from the first syllogism. Sorry, that's the second chain in the Sorites chain of syllogisms. That's the second link in the Sorites chain of syllogism. The second link in the Sorites, the second link in the chain of syllogism, is borrowing the subconclusion from the first link in the chain, from the first conclusion, and then borrowing this next premise. Now, what's the final conclusion of this? Therefore, people who do not, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands. That is the final conclusion of what we're given. Now, actually, I don't think that's the final conclusion. Okay, so the final conclusion is that the defendant did not shoot her husband. So actually, this is an enthymematic argument. It's an enthymeme because it leaves its final conclusion unstated. An enthymeme is an argument with an unstated step, usually an unstated premise, but sometimes an unstated conclusion. This argument has an unstated conclusion. And the unstated conclusion is that the defendant is innocent. I think we need to add another chain to our another link to our chain of syllogisms here. As before, we take the subconclusion of the former link in the chain, then we add the final conclusion, which is that the defendant did not shoot her husband. In context, this is fairly clear, although you sort of have to infer it. It might be less obvious. Just looking at the text here, exercise gives you endorphins, endorphins make you happy, happy people just don't shoot their husbands. If I had better video skills, maybe I'd play a clip of the film. Anyway, you can probably find it on the internet. All right, so you might notice that the premise, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands, therefore the defendant did not shoot her husband, it does not get you, you might notice that the premise, people who do not shoot, you might have noticed that the premise, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands, does not get you to the conclusion, therefore the defendant did not shoot her husband, unless we know that the defendant exercises. So I think we need to add that in as an unstated premise, one obvious from context, at least in the film. So this argument is enthymematic for two reasons. One, its final conclusion, the defendant did not shoot her husband, is not explicit. Two, the premise, the defendant exercises, is not explicit. So you have to bring out all those steps. So now we have the chain of syllogisms. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy, so people who exercise are happy. People who exercise are happy. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. Therefore, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands. People who exercise do not shoot their husbands. The defendant exercises. Therefore, she did not shoot her husband. That's our chain of syllogisms. And now we want to test each one for validity by itself. Now, this will take a little bit of work because we have to test each one. And first, you have to put each one into standard form. So let's see how I'm going to do this. Let me organize the text. I want to have this available, this rough scheme for testing categorical syllogisms for validity. First, the scheme of abbreviation where we identify what is the minor term, what is the major term, and what is the middle term of the argument. Then we put the argument into standard form using those designations for SPM as symbols for our argument, symbols for the terms in our argument. Then we just select one of these. You can do the Venn diagram method, you can do the mood figure method, or you can do the 6 rules method, or you can do any 2 or all 3. I don't think I'm going to do all 3 for all 3 of these syllogisms, but maybe I'll do 1 for each and mix it up. Okay, so this is our generic system for testing our syllogisms for validity. Let's copy and paste a little bit. Yes, that's about right. I think this will work nicely. In fact, let's go ahead and make some decisions now. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set this strategy up for our first syllogism. First, we're going to test this syllogism. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy, so people who exercise are happy. Test it for validity using the mood figure method. Then I'll test the next syllogism. People who exercise are happy. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. Therefore, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands. I'll test the next syllogism, the next chain, using the Venn diagramming method. Then I'll test that third link in the chain. Did I say the next chain? The third link in the chain, second link in the chain, third link in the chain. I'll test the third and final link in the chain. People who exercise do not shoot their husbands. The defendant exercises, therefore the defendant not shoot her husband. I will test that one for validity using the 6 rules method. There we go. I'll use one different method for each of these 3 syllogisms. A while ago, I said we're done because I said that's all. That's it. I think I said we're done, and I meant we're done explaining what a Sorites is and what you do with it. It's a chain of syllogisms. Usually the final conclusion is stated, but not the sub-conclusions. What you do with it is you break it into individual syllogisms, and you test each for validity by itself. So yes, that's all you need to know. But then most of the work comes in with practicing and being able to do it for yourself. So here is how I would do this for myself, beginning with this syllogism. Now, I think obviously our terms, well, I hope it's obvious, our terms have to be people. Happy people, people with endorphins, people who exercise. Our minor term is people who exercise, and that's pretty clear from the conclusion, people who exercise are happy. It's maybe not as clear that our major term is happy people. One of the standard rookie mistakes is to write P equals happy when you're supposed to write P equals happy people. M will be people with endorphins. And again, to review what rookie mistakes to avoid, if you're thinking people who exercise is the term given in the conclusion, but you're thinking the first premise doesn't say people who exercise, it just says exercise gives you endorphins. How do you translate a sentence like exercise gives you endorphins into standard form? E equals exercise, D equals endorphins, E gives you D or something like that? No, that's not standard form. All things that are exercise are things that give people endorphins would be fine for putting that into standard form, but it doesn't fit in with the rest of the argument. Now, in theory, we could do some extra work and say all people, all things that are exercise are things that give people endorphins, and find a way to get from there. I'm not even sure what the way would be. Find a way to get from there to our use of the term people who exercise. But let's just skip all that. Here is how we symbolize the first premise. Exercise gives you endorphins. All people who exercise are people with endorphins. That's how you symbolize the first premise. So this is the way to translate that first premise into standard form using the terms people who exercise and people with endorphins. All people who exercise are people with endorphins. Exercise gives you endorphins means all people who exercise are people with endorphins. That's what the argument is telling us. Now, that is the minor premise, you'll note. That's the one with S. All S are M, where S is people who exercise and P is, where S is people who exercise and M is people with endorphins. So that's our minor premise, which means it needs to be written second. Remember, the major premise is written first. The major premise is the one with the major term. The major term is the term appearing second in the conclusion. The minor term is the term appearing first in the conclusion. All right, so our major premise is going to be endorphins make you happy. So I guess that's going to be all MRP. That sure looks right to me. All people who exercise, no, all people with endorphins are happy people. Yes, that's it. Those are the categories in the argument that that we care about. And it's a perfectly faithful representation of the argument in context. Remember, the person making the argument, Reese Witherspoon's character, is trying to get us from the defendant exercises to the defendant did not shoot her husband. So the terms of the argument aren't actually, at least once you put it into standard form, the terms of the argument are not exercise, endorphins, and things like that. It's people who exercise, people who are happy, people who have endorphins, people who don't shoot their husbands, things like that. Oh, and people who are the defendant. We'll get to that one later, though. So the conclusion is all people who exercise are happy, all SRP. Now, another rookie mistake to avoid is to not add the all. Implicitly, this is an affirmative, not a negative claim, an affirmation, not a denial. It is saying that people who exercise are happy people, not that they're not happy people. And the word all does not appear in the original argument. In fact, in the original argument, we don't even have that premise stated. So is the premise universal? Is it talking about all people who exercise? Yes, it is. That's implied by what Reese Witherspoon is talking about. That's also what's entailed by the premises. So you have to decide when you're representing an argument in standard form, if it just says people who exercise are happy, whether it's universal or particular. Politicians are liars. Guinea pigs are not hamsters. Are we talking about all guinea pigs, in which case you've put it in standard form to say no guinea pigs are hamsters? Or and are we talking about all politicians, in which case you put it into standard form by saying all politicians are liars? Usually in context, it will be clear. Probably this grammatical form, X, R, Y, with no all, no quantifier, no all or no or some, usually will be universal, and you need to use all or no, not some. But in context, that will not always be the case. Anyway, this is the right way to translate this into standard form. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy, so people who exercise are happy. Is all MRP, all SRM, so all SRP. When S is people who exercise, P is happy people, and M equals people with endorphins. And now we put it in, now we identify the mood in the figure. At this point, this should be easy. Go back and watch earlier videos on categorical syllogisms if you don't know what's going on here. The mood is AAA. These are three A form propositions, three universal affirmative propositions. What figure? I'm thinking this is figure 1. This is figure 1. This is a barbarous syllogism. The middle term is first in the first premise, second in the second premise, which makes it figure 1. It's that particular horizontal, that particular diagonal line. If you remember, my only mnemonic device is the diagonal lines and the straight lines. Again, go back and watch earlier videos if it works. So it's this one. It's figure 1 AAA, barbarous syllogism, which is to say, never forget this step, it's valid. Never forget to state the argument's valid after you've shown that it's valid, or invalid after you've shown it's invalid. It's valid because it's one of the valid forms. Now, people who exercise are happy. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. Therefore, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands is our next chain in the syllogism. And you might be thinking, well, people who exercise is S, and happy people is P. And you would be making, again, one of those rookie mistakes. That's exactly the sort of thing you should do if you're at a certain stage of studying logic. If you're doing the whole chain of syllogisms all together, and you're assigning one letter to each term and looking at the argument all by itself, of course you use the same letter for each term every time it appears. But this is different. Now we've broken up our syllogism into we've broken up our chain of syllogisms into 3 different links. We've broken up our chain of syllogisms into 3 different syllogisms. So for each one, we're free to readjust our symbols, and we should, because we're testing each one for validity by itself. And that means using the strategies we've learned at this point. Go back and watch earlier videos if you haven't learned them. Using the strategies we've learned, we want to use S for the minor term of this argument, which is people who exercise. And we want to use people who shoot their husbands for the major term. What was I saying there? S is what we want to use for the minor term, which is people who exercise. P is what we want to use for the major term, people who shoot their husbands. And happy people is M. M we want to use for the middle term, which is happy people. And again, actually not again, because I think I never completed this thought. Now that we're testing for validity all by itself, this chain in our, this link in our chain of syllogisms, this particular syllogism out of our group of 3 syllogisms, now that we're testing it for validity all by itself, using our symbols properly, we use S to symbolize the minor term of this argument, P to symbolize the major term of this argument, and M to symbolize the middle term of this argument. So people who exercise is S, people who shoot their husbands is P, happy people is M. Now the major premise is the one with P and M. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. So no P or M, that's what I'm getting. No happy people are people who shoot their husbands. Nope, I got that wrong. No MRP. It means the same thing, actually. You can convert an E proposition validly, but let's get it right. No MRP. No happy people are people who shoot their husbands. Now the minor premise, the one with the minor term, the one with S, people who exercise. People who exercise are happy is all S R M. All people who exercise are happy people. And the conclusion, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands. No S or P. No people who exercise are people who shoot their husbands. Let me go over this again. Let's see. People who exercise are happy. All people who exercise are happy people. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. No happy people are people who shoot their husbands. Therefore, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands. Therefore, no S. No people who exercise are people who shoot their husbands. No SRP. Good. We got it. Now let's test that for validity. And I do not know how to do that without going to a different program. So let's go to our old friend, Microsoft Paint. Such amazing technology here. All right, we're only going to shade things because we have only universal premises. So the premise, no MRP. We shade these regions to indicate there's nothing that's an M that's also a P. And all S or M, we shade these regions to indicate there's nothing that's an S but not an M. And that's the only Venn diagramming we need to do, but we still need to know how to work with it. So what do we find? Working with it, we find that the argument is valid. The conclusion, no SRP, has been charted. Here, let's, I'll redo this quickly in Microsoft Paint, just in case anyone still benefits from it. You shade these regions. You shade these regions with the minor premise, no S, all S or M. Nothing is an S, but not an M. And then you shade these regions, no M or P for the major premise. Nothing is an M and also a P. And shading, again, means emptiness, nothingness. It means there's nothing in these regions. So what regions are we looking for to see if they're shaded for the conclusion? These two. All the overlapping regions of S and P. The conclusion says nothing is an S and also a P. It turns out that half of that conclusion was given us by the first premise and half was given by the second premise. So this is a valid argument. And we can close Microsoft Paint. And now, since it's valid, we really don't want to forget to state valid. Finally, people who exercise do not shoot their husbands. Final chain in the Sorites. People who exercise do not shoot their husbands. The defendant exercises, therefore the defendant did not shoot her husband. Exercise, the husband, defendant. People who are the defendant is the minor term. One more rookie mistake to avoid, failing to put it into a plural form. The minor term is people who are the defendant, not just the defendant. The defendant did not shoot her husband. The major term is Let's keep it all present tense. People who shoot their husbands. Minor term, I suppose, is going to have to be people who exercise. I think this is going to be another Barbara, but we'll see. People who are the defendant is the minor term. People who shoot their husbands is the major term. And the conclusion is no SRP. No people who are the defendant are people who shoot their husbands. Now, major premise is the one with M and P. People who shoot their husbands, people who exercise. People who exercise do not shoot their husbands, no MRP. The major premise is no people who exercise are people who shoot their husbands. The minor premise is all people who are the defendant are people who exercise. Oh, this is certainly not a Barbara syllogism. This is EAE. But we're supposed to be using the 6 rules method for this one. So let's check the 6 rules. A valid categorical syllogism must be standard form containing exactly 3 terms. No problem. This syllogism does not break that rule. In a valid categorical syllogism, the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. The middle term is distributed in the first premise of this argument because the middle term is M, and M is distributed in the first premise. It's distributed in the first premise because it's in the first premise, and the first premise is an E-form proposition. A term is distributed, you recall, when a statement makes some claim about everything denoted by the term. So when we say no people who exercise are people who shoot their husbands, we're making a claim about all people who exercise, or making claims about all people who shoot their husbands, namely that they're never the same people. So both terms are distributed. That's how an E proposition works. It distributes both terms. So in a valid categorical syllogism, third rule, a term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises. Well, good. The conclusion is another E proposition, so it distributes S and P. So they should be distributed in both premises. And the first premise is an E proposition, so it distributes both of its terms, so P is distributed. The second premise is A proposition. A propositions distribute the first term. When I say all guinea pigs are mammals, all mammals are animals, all teas are wonderful, all people who are Mark are tired people, I'm saying something about every guinea pig, every person who's Mark, every tea, every mammal, or whatever I was talking about in those illustrations. The first term is distributed in an A-form proposition, so each premise distributes each term that turns up in the conclusion. So no problem for that rule. Finally, well, no, we've still got 3 more. A valid categorical syllogism must not have 2 negative premises. We have 1 affirmative premise, the minor premise. All SRM is affirmative, not negative, no problem. In a valid categorical syllogism, if a premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Again, no problem. The premise, no MRP, is negative. The conclusion is also negative, no problem. In a valid categorical syllogism, if the premises are both universal, the conclusion must be universal. No problem, our conclusion is universal. So this is, again, a valid argument. So the whole chain of syllogisms is also a valid argument. It's made of 3 syllogisms, each of which is valid. Righto. I have to check my notes. If we're not done with categorical logic, we're super close. We're probably done, but we'll see next week. Maybe there's a quick review video that would be in order. If so, see you then. If not, see you in the next video on statement logic, I suppose. Thanks for watching.